Hi, so welcome to the Perspectives on the Polish Game Market. My name is David Chang. I'm joined by Jason De La Roca and Alexander Champlin, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a little bit. A little bit about myself. I started off my career at IGN in corporate development. I've founded a bunch of startups. I had my own game business in Berlin, Germany, and had a successful exit there, and have served in a variety of corporate development roles since then. For the last 2 years, I established my own investment bank where we are helping companies on the M&A side, as well as doing early stage investments. I've been involved in the Polish market through my relationship with Bloober Team, and we thought it would be a really interesting topic to talk about sort of international perspectives for what's going on in the Polish game market. And so I'm glad that you can join us. With that, I'll turn it over to Jason and introduce himself and give a little bit of background.
Hello, David. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me on the panel. Big fan of the Polish market. I've been to Digital Dragons in person before. It was a great experience. So I've been in the game industry about 25 years. A good portion of that has been working with indie developers and startups. And on the entrepreneurial side of things, about 10 years ago, I co-founded something called Execution Labs, which was at the time the first venture-backed game studio-focused accelerator program. And we did about 25 early stage investments into game studios, including one from Poland, mostly Europe, Canada, and United States. And now I do a bunch of consulting and advisory work on fundraising strategy and pitching and just overall kind of business, smarts for game studios and entrepreneurs who sometimes don't necessarily have, all the good business strategies and need help to kind of complement their awesome development skills.
It makes sense. I'm glad you could join us. Alex?
Hey, David. Lovely to join you. Hello, everyone out there watching. I'm Alex Champlin. I'm a senior analyst with Nico Partners. We're a research firm covering the games industry in Asia. And my area of expertise is really on esports and sort of emerging media around games. But we cover the games industry in Asia broadly, and it's been a really fascinating market to watch over the last year.
For sure. I mean, actually, that's a great segue in sort of setting the environment. I'll throw it out there. How the last 2 years have affected the game market in general. I'll turn it over to Jason to maybe talk about the North American market, and then maybe Alex and sort of trends that you're seeing in Asia.
Yeah, well, I mean, the industry as a whole was kind of on an upward trajectory, prior to the pandemic. And then, it's pretty kind of common knowledge now that the lockdown and all that had a very positive effect from a commercial point of view. Of course, introduced all kinds of challenges in terms of work-life balance and, remote development, all that kind of stuff. But I think, from an economic point of view, the game industry was one of the bright stars. Interestingly, a bunch of the work that I do is also around economic policy and working with governments on how to grow and nurture their local game industry. And
Right.
like the numbers of calls I've been getting from governments saying, oh, we've looked around our economy that's been kind of going downward, and we see this game thing going up. Like, how do we accelerate that? What do we have to do as a country from a policy point of view to sort of nurture that even more and kind of make our local economy a bit more resilient by relying on the success of games? So that's kind of been interesting to see in the past year and a half, is not only the kind of cultural acceptance of or a wider cultural acceptance of games as like a healthy, good thing for people to play and connect and socialize, but then kind of a governmental recognition of like, oh crap, this is like actually a good industry to be in as a nation. How do we nurture that? And then I think as well, that's then reflected by the public markets, by M&A activity, by the rush of new early stage investment funds. So, I mean, everything's just sort of, accelerating at an amazing pace.
Absolutely. And actually, that's a great point that you bring up. I'm going to give Alex a chance to talk, but I definitely want to probe sort of what are the qualities that you recommend, or the actions that you sort of recommend prescriptively for governments that want to sort of embrace the industry. So, Alex?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Jason said. I think Asia's been a really interesting case over the last 2 years. Obviously one of the sort of the first reasons to kind of feel the impact of the global pandemic. And so, certainly we've seen a real dramatic uptick in just engagement with gaming, the sort of the social value of gaming. As I said, my sort of area of focus is on esports, and so that's a sort of a branch of the games market that's done, despite the sort of the limitations that have been imposed on tournaments, it's done really phenomenally as people have kind of turned to streaming media and games media. And so we've seen in Asia a real interest in expanding investments in gaming, both from national interests who are seeing a real high degree of sort of gaming subsidies being created, gaming hubs or gaming cities cropping up across the region. But we're also seeing a lot more, a lot more kind of cross-pollination between the games industry and other industries. So you're seeing
Absolutely.
Gaming companies in Asia really taking an interest in gaming as a multimedia phenomenon. And so that's been one of the things that's really fascinating. Asia is also an interesting case because mobile gaming has done phenomenally during the pandemic, but PC gaming and console gaming, PC gaming in particular, has really kind of relied on an internet cafe culture that we don't really think of here in the West. And so that's one of the areas that's kind of struggled. And so it's been an interesting balance to kind of see that play out.
Yeah. And you mentioned a couple of things there that I wanted to sort of probe on, because I know that, for example, the Polish market does support the game industry through subsidies as well. And so maybe that's like an interesting segue, Jason, into sort of when governments ask you, how do we support the game industry, the content creation industry, what are your prescriptives for that? And then how do subsidies sort of fit in there? Are they, a net positive, a net negative, or when those subsidies go away, do people leave?
Yeah. I mean, well, we can do a whole summit just on this topic.
Yeah.
So it's a fairly complex, macroeconomic type of question. The reality is that the prescription is different for every region, right? What you would do to grow and nurture the industry in Poland is going to be different than Canada, is going to be different than New Zealand, just because of scale, the maturity of talent, the sort of history or pedigree of existing companies and activity, presence of investors, presence of public markets, right? Like each region has a different set of ingredients that you need to map out to then even see, well, where are the gaps, where are the shortfalls, where are the strengths, and then how do you fill those gaps and so on. So in less mature regions, the prescription is often around talent development, right? So setting up both indigenous talent, meaning people on the ground being educated, having the right training programs and opportunities, but then also streamlining entry of new talent, right? Yeah. So now you're starting to get into legislation and policy around visas and work permits, and some countries like Canada, for example, games or certain roles in a game studio are part of like a streamlined fast entry, so that some of the big game studios can say, oh well, we need David, he's the only one in the world that can do what David does. Okay, well then you can come in quickly. So there's stuff there all around talent flow. And also for these less mature regions, it's generally about IP development. Mm-hmm. And this is often a mistake that many governments make, is that they think the way they solve the kind of build a game industry problem is to get Ubisoft or EA or one of the big ones to just sort of show up, right, and open an office. I mean, that's great if they do, but that doesn't really solve the sort of the challenge of growing an industry from scratch. And so it tends to be more about early stage access to funding, angel investment, seed and prototype funds. So it's more about cash in than sort of a tax rebate or relief at the end. Now, in more mature sectors where you have existing companies that are generating games, and there's millions, if not tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue, then you can look at sort of later stage optimization in terms of ease of access to get listed, or tax incentives, so that when you make these big profits or big labor spends, you're able to kind of reduce cost of operation. So you might look at those kinds of instruments, but the often a region doesn't realize sort of where they are on that scale. And so they start looking at somewhere like Canada and say, oh, there's tax breaks up in Canada, and look at the size of the industry. Let's go put a tax break in the middle of the jungle, and then assume that a game industry will emerge out of nothing. Whereas really it's more about create the talent, provide early stage funding for new IP to get created. And then that kind of gets the flywheel going. But I mean, again, I could talk for hours on this topic.
Yeah, maybe just a short follow-up there. I mean, because, I think I see a lot of parallels between, the Canadian market and what's going on in Poland, in the sense that, the Canadian market it was, a very hot market for a while, and it still has a very robust community in terms of development. Could you potentially sort of point out one or two things that you think Canada did really, really well, and then maybe one or two things that sort of missed the mark, so that maybe people listening in Poland can.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm quite critical of Canada in that I believe their overall policy was too heavily weighted towards attraction of foreign companies to come in. There's a certain seduction to say that, well, we've got Ubisoft and EA and Square Enix and now Tencent. There's a sexiness to that, and you get a nice kind of photo op and a good press release. And that should always be part of your policy to kind of bring in kind of foreign investment, but you never want it to be too imbalanced. You always want to then also be nurturing startups, entrepreneurs, providing seed funding for new IP. So you want a more balanced ecosystem. So I think Canada, for all the success that it had to attract foreign entities, kind of lagged in terms of creating a more balanced ecosystem for entrepreneurship and new IP to emerge. And interestingly, I mean, this is not really a kind of a patriotic thing. I mean, whatever, I'm from Canada, I love Canada, whatever, but it's not a patriotic thing. The issue is that if you are too overweighted on the foreign entity side,
right,
you do not have founders that can exit. Right? Because if you're the manager of the EA office, well, you're a well-paid manager, a GM, you drive a nice car, you have a nice house, but you never really, you don't get an exit, because the EA Montreal office is not exitable. And so then you never really become an angel investor. And so the ecosystem then always has this gap of never birthing new angels, because everyone's just a manager of a foreign office. And then what that means is it overburdens the government, which then is put under pressure to fill the gap of the lack of angels, so that the government has a seed fund or an early stage prototype, because there's no angels around to provide that early stage funding. And that's where you get a bit of that kind of imbalance. So, I mean, there's many more aspects to it, but one of it is you want the local companies to emerge, to create talent, so that they can get bought eventually, and then that births an angel that then alleviates the pressure on the government to fill that gap.
Right. That's actually a really great observation, and perhaps that's something that the Polish market has done very well, in the sense that CD Projekt is still at the top of public market sort of valuation there, and that's obviously a local company. And as an investment banker, I mean, I know that I've seen some of the big players that you're talking about ask for some help or some thoughts about establishing development centers there. But at least it's my impression that those development centers aren't leading sort of IP creation in that region. So perhaps that's something that Poland is doing well and in their favor.
Well, and I mean, I'm going to be curious to hear from Alexander in terms of what that looks like in Asia. But
absolutely,
if you contrast Canada with Finland, for example, when Finland was really having its burst in kind of 2010, 11, 12 plus, I mean, all of the government intervention was focused on local companies, local entrepreneurs, backing projects in R&D to create content, to professionalize. So none of the incentives were to bring in the foreign folks. But then that success brought in tens of millions of dollars from foreign venture funding, and then of
Yes.
course brought attraction in terms of the M&A side of things. And then you
Yes.
even started to see some of the Finnish companies then get listed, often on the Swedish NASDAQ. But you start to see some of that activity as well. But yeah, I'm curious to hear the sort of Asian perspective and how it compares.
Yeah, absolutely, Alex. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Really fascinating. And I think, a lot of what you've said, Jason, has kind of sparked some things for me. Asia is an interesting case because, it's one of the largest markets. There's a lot of activity going on in terms of the sort of the development of new talent, new developers, indie developers, but it's also one of the most heavily regulated games markets in the world, and so that creates a pretty serious tension, attention in that market. And so what we're seeing is, in China, for example, we're seeing a lot of smaller indie developers kind of look, in terms of their sort of IP creation, look to external markets as a sort of a place to build a foundation. Just because there's, so in China, there's such a sort of a limitation on the number of license approvals that will occur in a given year. And so it's, and a lot of these go to larger companies like Tencent or NetEase. And so indie developers are looking to sort of alternative platforms like Steam or international platforms as a way to sort of to move their products. And so we're also seeing a lot of mergers and acquisitions kind of happen around that trend, as well as as these smaller companies kind of look to get acquired by some of the big players in the market. Asia is also, an interesting case because it's got some of the sort of the largest and most notable games companies in the world. Obviously, Tencent is making waves. But Japan is one of the oldest games markets, and so there's a lot of expertise kind of in Asia already. And there's, what we're seeing is we're seeing these companies, particularly sort of the large companies like Tencent and NetEase, kind of invest in, as I said earlier, sort of a broader understanding of games and games media, and so developing their esports partnerships, or their streaming media, or even their investment in other kinds of media. But we're also seeing from game developers specifically a real interest in moving away from kind of simple mobile titles towards much more kind of complex AAA games, and kind of looking to compete with Western developers. And so one of the kind of approaches to arriving at this has been to build an international kind of expertise. And so we're seeing NetEase, for example, launching a studio in Montreal, and a studio in Japan recently. We're seeing a lot of obviously acquisitions from Tencent of Western game companies to kind of build this expertise and bring in that talent. And so it's an interesting kind of mix. I mean, subsidies are a really big part of this, particularly in Asia. And kind of what we're seeing in China is a real interest in kind of building these, like almost the capitals of game development or game creation. So like city level investment in kind of creating, tech hubs and things like that.
And if I could just sort of interject, like, the thought that occurred to me is that, yes, obviously there's some really big acquirers that are from Asia. And it seems to me that their strategy is to acquire talent and IP, et cetera, globally. And that's how they sort of get to that global market. I think one of the things that Jason touched on, and one of the things that potentially is very relevant for Poland, is that of that sort of local organic talent development, right? And how that's important. Is that a focus in a lot of these in China, for example, where, people are encouraged to become a video game developer or start, as a career? Or is it much more the latter, where it's, sort of tax breaks, and then look, if you're gonna do this, it's a subsector of, the tech sector, and let the chips fall where they may?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think certainly there's a growing infrastructure at sort of the, at the university level for kind of creating game experts, creating games, and kind of creating a talent pipeline. I think the sort of the difficulty in Asia is that, a lot of these smaller studios are kind of, historically the emphasis has really been on, like kind of picking up slack for some of these larger companies. And so there, a lot of these smaller independent, there's been a real growth in the sort of the number of smaller independent developers in China over the last few years. But they really they hit a ceiling, and they struggle against that sort of regulatory environment. And so, what the industry is kind of focused on instead is building studios that can, they can support a larger game studio, and sort of, work for the development or something like that. And so it's an interesting tension on the ecosystem. But yeah, I think at the national level, there hasn't really been.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of jump in there. I mean, what's interesting, Alex, I mean, again, if you have an opinion on Japan, right? I mean, just culturally, you haven't seen a history of this kind of startup entrepreneurship, that the mindset around risk and failure is just different at a kind of a cultural level. Interestingly enough, just this past year, there was a new indie game incubator started in Japan. So it's gonna be interesting to see kind of what comes out of that. And so I think this is where maybe Poland is ahead in many ways, in that you do see a lot of startups, a lot of new studios, a lot of IP being created. I mean, certainly CD Projekt kind of, has a lot of that talent coming through it, and Techland and a few of the other big ones. Right. But there is a healthy kind of noise, like there's just stuff going on, new startups, ideas, project, whatever. I think the challenge that Poland has is almost similar to Finland, like from a decade ago, which is it was heavily development and talent focused, heavily engineering oriented, with no real savvy around business, IP, franchise development, monetization, all this kind of stuff. And I mean, Finland in particular, one of their governmental funds required that you had to submit a marketing plan and a business plan in order to get the money. Yep. And all the sort of the techie, nerdy Finnish game developers like, my tech is so good, just give me the money. Why do I need to bother with this silly business plan? But they had to do it. Like it was the stick and the carrot, and they wanted the carrot, so they had to go through that pain. But essentially, it kind of forced the entire sector to professionalize and go through that exercise and effort. And then, a bit chicken and egg, all of a sudden they started to succeed more, and they understood that, okay, to get the carrot, we have to be more professional, et cetera. And so I think Poland might be in that sort of phase where there's just a lot of good stuff, really strong talent, but they're kind of brute forcing it. It's like, we're so talented, we're just going to do our thing and success will come. And some success does come, and there are certain opportunities, but I think there's an opportunity there. But it's starting from a good place, because there's already that creation happening, that talent is on the ground.
Yeah, that's a really, really great point, actually. I'm somewhat familiar with how Poland subsidizes game companies in general. And a lot of that is, some of those subsidies are tied to a technical component where, if you have a patent or you have a new design sort of innovation, that kind of stuff. But that is very technical. But I agree with your overall observation in that the sense that, IP sort of drives the video game industry, right? Certainly technical innovation is part of that, but to sort of incent people to create brands and IP around this technology, I think is perhaps something that Poland should take a perspective to, and sort of really think about how they can incent. I mean, certainly, Cyberpunk, for all of its troubles, right? Very, very big new IP. And you mentioned Japan. So I think we're seeing, and I have personal experience here, right? I mean, Bloober announced their strategic deal with Konami. And, I think that that's very indicative of Japan looking to international markets for innovation and sort of collaboration. And I think that's sort of new, right? In the sense that a lot of times Japan is kind of seen as the Galapagos of video games, and certainly would love to hear Alex's opinion about that. I could be completely off base.
No, I mean, I think that is kind of, I've never heard that characterization.
Oh, really? I guess I only say it to friends.
But it is, even looking at Asia, it's one of the, we treat it kind of almost as an outlier. There's, from so many different perspectives, they're console first, and the rest of the region is mobile. I mean, now everybody's mobile first, but when the rest of the region was PC first and mobile second. And it's still a very very IP driven market, very buy to play premium driven market, and so in a lot of ways it's been an outlier. I think as the rest of Asia at least kind of develops in terms of the sort of the kinds of games that consumers are choosing, the sort of the desire for really kind of like high level experiences, and we're seeing this in this has been a sort of a mobile first market, and I think as mobile is kind of maturing, there's, from a consumer standpoint, there's a real interest in seeing the kinds of experiences that you would get with like a PC or a console kind of AAA title moving over to mobile. And so, something like Genshin Impact had a really phenomenal year last year because it kind of blended those two experiences. And so I think as those markets are maturing, there's a real interest in what Japan has cultivated across the region. And we're seeing a sort of a greater interest in what they have to teach game developers in Asia, and what other AAA game developers kind of have to offer that region as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, look, really big fan of the IP that comes out of that region. And in this, to sort of move along in sort of topics, one of the things that you mentioned earlier, Alex, reminded me of what an investment banker from China told me, in terms of sort of understanding how deals go down out there, is that in the West we sort of think about valuation and competitive bid processes, et cetera, and those are the important things. He told me the number one thing that investment bankers think about in pursuing M&A is whether or not this transaction will be regulatorily approved. Is that accurate?
I think to a certain degree, but I think another, a real big part of it is talent as well. It's expertise. And so, the valuation is important, but what we're really seeing from, across the region is there's a real interest in, in acquiring and sharing expertise. And
can I ask you to repeat that again?
Expertise. So talent. We're seeing a real interest in bringing experienced game developers, studio heads over from the West into Asia, and even more regionally. There's a lot of interest in in acquiring studios that have a lot of potential. And so I think that's certainly valuation's a factor. And I think there's, the regulatory environment is, it's very different than it is in the West. And I think it's looming, and a lot of the sort of the business that Nico Partners does is, helping companies kind of interpret that, that space. And I think, China is the most obviously complex. but I think it's true across the region. And so certainly that's a framing factor, but I think the real motivating factor is, is sort of building something long term and moving people around that can bring something to the developer to it.
That's super helpful. Thank you. Jason, in terms of the M&A market out in the West, obviously there's been a lot of deals. Is there a theme there that you can sort of pick out from all of the, the signal, that's coming through? Is it just sort of everybody has a bunch of different priorities? Because one thing I think Alex mentioned that I've also observed is that, if companies from Asia in general are looking for talent and expertise, I think Poland is very well situated for that. There are some issues about Poland that we can talk about in a second that sort of are chilling factors, but it seems to me that in the West, it's really not so much about expertise. It's a little bit more about, size and growth and some other things, but
yeah, I mean, it's hard to kind of, have a one-line summary.
Yep.
It's been a kind of a bonkers year or two on the M&A side. I mean, a lot of the deals I see, there is a certain threshold of profitability, which a lot of the founders kind of forget about, right? That M&A is not an investment. They're like, they're acquiring you. And often what they're acquiring is your profitability. To what degree are you profitable? Obviously there's sort of different ways to measure that or different levels of attraction. But I think it's important to recall that in many cases, they're actually buying you because you're profitable. Now, that, profit in a way, not only is just sort of absolutely good, but is also an indicator that you're a good company that has talent and expertise, because it's not easy to be profitable as a game studio, in the industry. So it's like the profits are valuable in and of themselves, but they're also an indicator that, oh, this is a good company, an attractive company. I mean, we do see some deals, I guess, I mean, not quite acqui-hire, but more about, just the raw acquisition of those brains and development capacity. And we do see that, but I would say that that's less common. And certainly the deals that I see tend to be much more of, oh, this is a profitable company. Okay, what kind of talent? What's the value of their IP and brands? And is there a track record of consistency and that kind of stuff? Do we see a bright future for the upcoming games and so on? Yeah, I mean, if you're a founder out there thinking that, someone's going to come by and buy you and you're going to get a nice exit, I mean, you first have that hurdle to actually be a successful company that's generating profits that's worth buying.
Right. Yeah, what I've seen is that, look, if you have great fundamentals and you're a profitable company, at least for Western companies, honestly, it doesn't matter whether or not you're public or private, right? In some ways, it's the transaction details are the transaction details. Which brings me to an interesting sort of observation about the Polish market, in the sense that we have a lot of young, relatively immature companies on the Polish market. And I do think that presents a challenge, because I do have a slide here that I can show that when I asked our team to put together multiples, right? When you look at Poland, doesn't look that bad when you just look at it at a PE multiple level, right? But I think that this sort of hides a lot of issues that are important in terms of sort of how long this company has been around, overall size, strength of earnings, all of this other stuff. And to me, at least from what I've seen, in M&A processes, that becomes a real issue. Alex, in Asia, is there a difference between appetite in terms of, acquiring public companies or private companies?
That's interesting. I'm honestly, I'm really not sure. I think so. What we've seen in the last year was a real dramatic uptick in M&A activity. Over 2019, at least in China, almost like a threefold increase in M&A activity. But what we track that too is there's been a real strong growth in terms of in terms of very small uh, private independent games companies, and their acquisition is almost almost always, or at least their investment is almost always uh, from one of these sort of leading game publishers like Tencent or NetEase or Garena in Southeast Asia. And so, what it kind of really signals to us is that there's these strong players in the market that are trying to consolidate their influence, and that there's sort of the regulatory environment forces these smaller companies to seek support. Is that sort of?
Yeah, you faded out like for the last 2 seconds there.
The regulatory environment forces smaller companies to kind of seek that kind of investment, that these larger companies become a kind of. And I think the other thing is Asia's I guess sort of like Europe, Asia's a very complex market. It's not like talking about North America where you have the US and Canada, and so there's a lot of regulatory environments to think about, but a lot of different kind of cultural appetites for games as well. And so, if you think of something like Southeast Asia, I mean, that's a complex space to navigate, and Garena's really kind of built an expertise on navigating that space, and so we're seeing smaller companies kind of seek those partnerships as a way of navigating and sort of expanding their brand.
Yeah, that's actually, go ahead, sorry, Jason, yeah.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to comment a little bit on this kind of, relatively less mature companies going on to the markets. I mean, on the one hand, it's very exciting to see that access to capital in that way and providing additional instruments for developers and entrepreneurs. But, there's definitely some dangers there. And one concern is just sort of the literacy of the investors. I mean, when you're in a public market, it's like who's buying those shares? I mean, it's not all savvy, people who understand monetization models and game industry timelines and trend. Like, it's just, hey, I missed my chance to get into CD Projekt. Here's the next cool thing. My friend of a friend told me this is hot stuff, and so I bought some stock. Like you just don't know how that happens, and so there's definitely a concern there that some of those kind of less savvy investors are going to get burnt, because not every listed game company is going to become the next CD Projekt Red. And, so there's definitely some issues there, because if you let those companies onto the market too early, just the fact that they have access to capital doesn't guarantee that they're going to succeed, which then also brings me to another kind of concern that no one really talks about is when you take on, a game VC as an investment partner or other sort of savvy industry sort of endemic partners, they have connections, they have expertise. Many of them have been operators themselves. If you look at LVP, David Gardner was the head of EA in Europe for how many, and you list any of the game funds, and almost all of them have game operators and past entrepreneurs as the principals.
Yes. And
there's a value to that beyond the cash, that they provide guidance, mentorship, a certain oversight, and that sort of helps you build the company, et cetera. Whereas if you just sort of skip that and say, oh, well, look, I can go get listed and get a bunch of money from, who knows who, that doesn't really come in the same way. So I think there's a danger there that just because you went through the hoops to get onto the market, that doesn't mean there's any sort of real chance that you're going to succeed.
Yeah, and look, I've certainly witnessed this in other quote unquote hot markets where they have like a junior market, which is really more of a fundraising platform than anything. And sometimes it's difficult. It's difficult because you see a bunch of companies get trapped there. You see companies that are go out early, right, with the barest of business plans, right, and hopefully
they
that
get
will.
burnt, and then the investors get cold feet after that and say, "Oh, forget it. I lost my money or I got," and then they never come again. And so it's tricky. It's a tricky space.
Yeah, and I think one thing that you both pointed out in terms of Alex was talking about strategic investors sort of investing in and filling that sort of private funding gap, and then Jason, you were talking about seasoned venture capital. What I've seen personally in Poland is this sort of rush to these public markets where even a startup that is collecting private capital today from, let's say, angel investors or even small venture capital outfits in Poland, there is almost a magnet that is pulling them towards listing, right? Whereas in America or in other markets, the conversation is a little bit more about, okay, well, what are your use of funds? How is this going? What's your game going to be like? What's the business plan? And I think, unfortunately, at least what I personally observed is that, in Poland, it's a little bit about, okay, well, if we give you this money, T minus how many months are you going to get to listing? And I don't know if that's necessarily healthy.
Well, and David, I would add, and this might be my personal bias, but whenever someone in North America would be talking about like, oh, I'm going to go get listed to get my funding, I'm like, oh, this is a scam. Like this is, there's some snake oil here, all kinds of red flags and alarms as well. Now, of course, if you're Roblox being listed for $1 billion, I mean, that's okay. That's the way it's supposed to be. Sure. And I mean, that speaks more to the, there's no junior market. There's no sort of more speculative exchange, this kind of stuff. But so much so that if anyone ever said, oh, I'm going to do some, like the alarms went off. Whereas that's not true if you're talking in the Nordics or in Poland, because it's kind of, as you say, it's like, how many months before we get listed? It's like a very common.
Yeah. Alex, are there any similar markets that kind of in Asia and some of the emerging ones, perhaps?
I was going to agree with Jason there. I think there's been there've been some very notable sort of large scale IPOs across Asia, but I think the trend is more often to seek investment. Can you ask that question again?
Yeah, I was wondering, because Jason and I were kind of talking about, this sort of, it's a bit unhealthy to sort of think about listings. It's almost cart before the horse, right? Like, are you going to create a great game? What's the team like? How are you going to use the funds? But have you seen that sort of dynamic play out in maybe some of the emerging markets in Asia as well? Or are they taking a much more stoic approach?
Like off the top of my head, I can't think of too many cases where that would be the case. I mean, I think, like broadly the sort of the strategy is to seek private investment and to seek acquisition. I think, and I think just because those markets are so dominated by, by sort of leading players that they kind of, they or their subsidies are, like 10% Billy or 10% with Doyu sort of managing investments for them. There's a lot more sort of there's a lot more kind of investment or hands on the sort of emerging developers through through their branches. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So look, guys, it's been great. I mean, we're just about out of time. If to wrap it up, though, I'd kind of like to for each one of us to say, if we had one wish for the Poland game industry, what would it be? What you could wave a magic wand. I'm kind of going to steal Jason's, honestly, and say that, I would love to see more international IP come out of Poland, right? I mean, because I do agree. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there, where a lot of these entities are really focusing on the technical component. And believe me, on the technical side of stuff, they can develop games just at a very, very high quality. But to see them sort of move over on the creative side and really start launching, AAA IPs that have global appeal, I think is the next big step for Poland in general.
Well, and then to sort of riff on that, I mean, Poland has a great emerging indie scene with all the talent, as you say, David. What they don't have much of are indie entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
And I think there's an opportunity there to, whether it's a formal acceleration program, whether it's introducing, kind of a business track or a marketing track at some of the schools that have game development degrees to kind of complement that with some of the production, management, marketing side of things. I think you want to really nurture and make it okay to kind of introduce an entrepreneurial layer. It's not only about the amazing artistic and design and development talent, but there's things that you can do tangibly to help that come along faster.
That's great. Alex, one wish?
Yeah, well, what I'll say is, we've said that, the launch of Cyberpunk in Asia was the biggest, or at least in China, was the biggest launch of an unlicensed game ever. I mean, it was really sort of phenomenally popular on the gray market, on Steam. And so, what I'd say is there's a real sort of fascination with, what Western AAA developers, Polish AAA developers are doing. Asia's paying attention. And so I think there's a lot of potential connection to that market and real sort of interested consumers out there.
Awesome. Well, look, thank you both for the discussion. Hopefully we picked some themes there that is useful for the audience on perspectives of the Polish game market. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Alex.
Thank
Thank you, David. Nice
Cheers.
to meet you, Jason.